So, welcome to the next edition of the FC podcast. As stated, we are excited to partner for season 1 of the FC podcast with the prestigious FIFA Master Alumni Association, bringing you some exclusive insights from some of the brightest minds in the world of sports business. I'm James Kitching, Managing Director of the FC and a 12th edition graduate of the FIFA Master. As part of this season, we'll be chatting with key leaders and leaders that have graduated from the FIFA Master from across the Asia and Oceania region, delving into their unique experiences and uncovering the secrets to their success in this dynamic industry that we know of sport. Now, it's a great pleasure today to welcome our good friend Sebastian Hassett, the Head of Government Relations and Strategy at Football Victoria. Seb, welcome to the FC podcast.
Thank you ever so much for having me, James. It's a real privilege to be here.
Yep, conflict of interest check, as we do at the top sometimes. Seb and I have known each other for a very long time. Seb used to work for my former business for a little bit, and accordingly, this may be a little bit more difficult for Seb, being cross-examined, as you would, by his former colleagues. So this will be a bit of fun on my side anyway. Seb, before we get underway, every guest asked to give a quick overview of themselves, name, nationality, FIFA Master Edition, and it doesn't need to be football, but favourite sports team and why. So over to you.
All right. So my name is Sebastian Hassett. I'm Australian, as you can no doubt tell from my thick accent. I was a member of the 17th edition, and my favourite sports team is Everton. I am a long-suffering Everton fan, and hopefully by the time people see this podcast, we will have secured our place in the Premier League for next season. Alas, nothing is guaranteed in this very topsy-turvy year, but no, they're my team.
No more points deductions coming along the way?
Hopefully there are no more surprises left. I think we've been deducted 8 points and we're hanging on like grim death. So quite frankly, as I said to somebody this morning, I'm just looking forward to the season being over and hopefully safety secured, and we can just hold on long enough to start our new life in our new stadium, which will be actually in the following year after next year. We can do that in the Premier League. Fingers crossed.
Brilliant. Well, for those who are playing along at home, we are recording this in the starting weeks of April. So by the time this comes out, hopefully good news for Evertonians around the world. Let's talk about you, and let's talk about your background. You have come into your role in Football Victoria from what I would say is a non-traditional pathway into the senior levels of sports administration. So please take our viewers and listeners through how you got to where you got to now and the steps along the journey.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a roundabout path, but I guess the common theme throughout it all is football. So realizing pretty early on that I wasn't going to be much of a player, but having this enormous passion for the sport, having been raised in an intensely sporting family to the point where my sister is on the coaching panel of an AFL women's team at the moment. So sport was really, growing up in regional Victoria in Australia, there was almost nothing else. So from a young age, it was playing tennis, playing cricket, playing golf, playing Aussie rules, and then actually, bizarrely, even though I didn't really play the sport growing up, ending up in football, in soccer, and it just happened to be, I happened to have the great fortune of growing up within reasonable proximity of a then National Soccer League team close to my hometown, about 25, 30 minutes away. The Morwell Falcons played and were in the National Soccer League at the time. That was my introduction to football. And through that, I just wanted to help that particular club. So this is when I was in high school. I started just really getting involved in this sort of media and marketing, first as pretty much as a volunteer. And then when the side actually exited the National Soccer League, in unfortunate circumstances. I was their last ever media liaison officer and I was 16 years old. So I was sort of cut in the cloth of it all pretty early. But then once I'd graduated from high school, I wanted to stay in the sporting world in some way. Found that my calling and my best way through was journalism. And so I ended up actually becoming a journalist for the next 15 years. And that was a profession that I'd like to think I had a small degree of success in. I ended up working for the largest newspaper in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald, for the better part of 10 years. Was on SBS television for even longer. And that's probably the role that people most know me for. So when I told a lot of people that I was actually moving out of journalism and wanting to switch into football administration, I think there was a little bit of surprise, probably from fellow people in the media, but also probably from administrators themselves, because I'd been grilling them for so long and asking deep and difficult questions. But I guess my exposure to them and having the opportunity to sort of look behind the curtain and see what it takes to actually, put sporting events together, to run leagues, to run competitions, to do all that, actually led me to thinking this is actually the career path that I'm more interested in doing. I'm more interested in actually doing that than I am writing about it now. And that was just a natural transition and progression for me. And as I'm sure you're aware, that's what actually really led me to doing the FIFA Master. And that acted as the bridge, you might say, between my previous life as a journalist and the life I am today as a football administrator.
Good. Great. And so, the next question was about the FIFA Master, and it's a perfect segue. Before we get to that, my views, and I think you're a perfect exponent of it, that journalists make great sports administrators, because people that tend to go into sports journalism, they have a passion for the sport that they report on, and perhaps are not the most athletically gifted, or are not as gifted as the full-time professionals, or have the opportunities that the full-time professionals end up receiving along the way. And that passion translates into writing and immersing themselves in the sport, writing about and immersing themselves in the sport, and then subsequently to admin. And I think you're a great exponent of that. There are a number around the world that, we've both come across that work in that space. I guess from the Master itself, and then moving forward to where you are now, what are some of the sort of the key lessons that you took from doing the FIFA Master, and then how did you progress from the FIFA Master to where you are now in a senior role at Football Victoria?
Yeah. So just to sort of give people watching this a little bit of context, when I was a journalist, then my final, probably about 2 years before I left, I'd actually made the decision to leave. And I wasn't exactly sure about how I was going to do it. So I actually went and saw the CEO of Football Australia, who I'd been covering his journey, David Gallop, for quite some time since he stepped into the role. So we knew each other very well. And I went and saw him and said, look, I've got an unusual request. This isn't an interview request. This is a bit of career advice that I need. And he'd been a very successful administrator in rugby league first, and then moved across to football, and still remains a sporting administrator to this day. And he said to me, quite frankly, look, you've got all the capacity to get to the very top here one day, or running a league or running a club, but you'll have to start by getting a qualification that validates that. So that might mean having to do 2 steps back to take 3 or 4 steps forward. So I went and looked at a variety of courses, actually met with a couple of universities, and was offered scholarships to 2 of them that I actually ended up rejecting in order to go and pursue the FIFA Master. And it was another alumni, Duncan Tweed. I happened to be sitting next to him at an event run by the Real Madrid Academy in Sydney. And it was there that he sort of proposed to me that if I was dead serious about actually making this transition and making a full transition into sporting administration, that I should seek to do the very best course in the world, and the best course in his opinion, and maybe he was a little bit biased from alumni, was indeed the FIFA Masters. So I then put in place I guess from that sort of look to contacts and people who've done the course, yourself inclusive in that, James, and you gave me some terrific advice about how to go about applying. And from that, ended up being on the course. And then once I was there, it really was, it was fantastic rounding for me, because I had, as much as I'd had some fantastic exposure to high level sport through the role that I had, and I was amazingly grateful for that, to actually know, really, you might call how the sausage gets made. This is all the back end to how sporting organisations get themselves organised so they put on the major events that I'd been attending for many years, how they put on the leagues, how they actually constitute themselves, what are their legal obligations, how do they balance their books financially. It really was about filling out that picture, because what I had, and you make a very good point about journalists actually having a really quite wide range of knowledge and interests. And that was certainly the case for me. I probably knew a little bit about everything, but may not have had the deep detail in some of the key pieces that are required to lead and run major sports organisations. So what the Master did incredibly well for me, and just probably a good example was, I hadn't operated a business before, and didn't know the ins and outs of a profit and loss, for example, and by the end of FIFA Master, I knew exactly how it worked, and then could analyse a company's annual report and could actually see what their business strategy was just by looking at the numbers. And so that sort of level of sort of educational decoding for me, and giving me a really good all-round perspective, was probably the rocket fuel I needed to surge into that next life.
Good, amazing. No, look, yeah, you got the look under the bonnet. You got to see over the fence, didn't you? It really opens up that other side of the business that for those that haven't sat on that side of the fence before can access. That's great. And look, so what about those things that you learned and how you apply them, in your day to day? First and foremost, tell our people what a day to day looks like for a head of government relations and strategy at Football Victoria. Maybe it might be good for some international viewers to explain what Football Victoria is as well, in the context of football in Australia from a structural perspective. So in that context, Football Victoria from a structural perspective, and how those things you learned at the FIFA Master tie in with, what's your day to day in your role.
And it is a unique kind of a unique ecosystem that exists in Australia, primarily due to the fact that it's not just a country, it's a continent, and it's an enormous continent at that. It is a huge place, and is roughly the size of Europe. So therefore, having just sort of one football association controlling everything, it could be feasible in the future, but for the moment, historically, you might say, the way that the sport has been organised has been on a state level. So the states are almost big countries of their own. And so Football Victoria is the second most populated state in Australia, but with over 6 million people, it's the equivalent size of a small to mid European country, and that's probably that's probably why we're separated into the states and territories that we are in Australia, and that's why we formed our football along that way, because from here to Sydney, or where you are in Adelaide, or to Brisbane and Perth, it's a long way, and it's not a day trip. So ultimately, we've sort of almost had to form these almost separate republics to administer the game, and that comes with some great challenges, but also some great opportunities. So, in effect, what my job then is primarily to deal with the state government here in Victoria that looks after the 6 million people who live here, and cooperate with them to help try and advocate for all the football facilities required across this state. So beneath the state government, which sits beneath the federal, the Australian government, We have the state government, and then below that, we have the local government. So there's 79 of them in Victoria. So I deal with each and every one of those at a sort of micro level, and then with the state government at a larger, more macro level. And the facility I'm very lucky to be sitting in today is the recently completed Home of the Matildas, which is the headquarters now of Football Victoria. It's nearly a $50 million investment from our state government. So I must say a very big thank you to them, because we've only just moved into these marvelous facilities, and I'd encourage everyone to Google the Home of the Matildas to see exactly what they've built here. It really is something special. So primarily it's things like that, those big, we've got 5 pitches here, the big facilities like that, but all the way down to the local facilities in small towns that need new drainage, floodlighting, new services, gender neutral change rooms, so it's accessible for men and women and boys and girls alike. It's really about getting across every single facility and getting them upgraded to the level required, so that our football community can have a wonderful experience, no matter where they are, no matter whether they're here, right in the heart of Melbourne, or whether, as I say, they're 3, 4, 5, 6 hours away, and some of them playing on the edge of the desert. But I view them all, having grown up in that small town myself. Every small facility is as important to me as this one. We want everyone to have a great experience. So that's what I spend the entirety really of my life doing at the moment.
Fascinating. I can imagine it's there are a lot of challenges in there that people from the outside would have absolutely no idea exist. When we just see government relations, we think you're just talking to the government and they're giving you money and it's all smooth and hunky-dory. But having a lot
of long lunches and the like. But it is just something I probably fill in people that they may not be aware. I mean, Australia has a very, very unique cultural landscape, not just a geographical one that I touched on before, but the cultural landscape here gives it an extra layer of challenge. I'm persistently having to explain the story of football to councillors and to politicians who they may not have grown up with the sport in the way that other people have in other countries. So they understand that football is growing, but they may not understand why, for example, that we need the exact facilities that we need. And all you have to do is to get on Google Maps and have a look at where we are in Melbourne. Have a look in metropolitan Melbourne at the green spaces, and you will see they are invariably ovals with cricket pitches on them, which are not primed for football. But our sport is the one that's growing, and those are the facilities that are being given to us, and we're kind of having to find our way with those. So there is some sort of natural conflict within that makes the role incredibly challenging. But with the scale of challenge comes the scale of opportunity. So the opportunity for the sport in this state and in this city and in this country, it's truly enormous. And that's what makes the role so interesting.
You can imagine. For those who are, non-Australian who are watching or listening, Melbourne does present some unique cultural barriers, let alone geographical barriers, as Seb mentioned, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, I would suggest, with the way that sport is structured in Victoria and in that state. All power and all credit to you for fighting the good fight for football in that space. Leadership. Let's talk about leadership. We've got about, I'd say, 10 or so minutes left of the chat. How do you manage all of those little things with so many different stakeholders pulling you in different directions, whilst also having to, on a day-to-day deal with your state governments at a macro level and your councils at a micro level, clubs, big and small, maybe associations, subject to how the club is organised. Maybe this is the biggest club in this regional area. Your players and everyone else that's involved in the game. Talk to us first about, leadership and how you manage that, leading in that role from where you are, and then second, maybe how you manage those stakeholders as part of that process, because that's just a fascinating element that we've seen with everyone we've spoken to, actually, because everyone's been in a senior role, and the stakeholder management has been key to their success or otherwise. So it'd be interesting for you from a leadership perspective to see how you deal with your day-to-day leadership, and then how you do your stakeholder management on, as part of that, or aside from that as well?
Yeah. So it's a great question about leadership, and it's something that I've studied extensively, both within the FIFA Master and then also outside of that on my own terms. I do believe that the type of leadership model that you execute really depends on a number of factors, most of them environmental, because sometimes you may need to take a more authoritarian stance in order to get things done at a relatively quick nature. But then there are other times where probably the leadership model that I have now is probably much more of a servant model leadership. So it actually is about empowering the people around me to go and make the decisions that they need. So, for example, the staff that I manage who sit under me, they manage different regions. And I tell them all the time, I want you to imagine you are, as you're doing your job, you are on the freeway, and my job is to take all the objects off that freeway so you can go as fast as possible and achieve as much as possible. But I need you to tell me what those objects are so I can get them out of the way. You can go and actually accomplish things. I tell them that they are the CEOs of their areas. They get to make the final call. But come to me if you need a second pair of eyes, if you need me to help you to get to the decision, or you need to get to the outcome that you want. I'll be there to serve you, to help you get there. And the growth that the employees that we have here, the growth that they've been able to achieve in that time has been quite phenomenal. And look, as I say, leadership is very much environmental dependent. But in this particular ecosystem here in Victorian football, there are a lot of stakeholders, which sort of patches in nicely to the second part of the question, is because there are so many stakeholders that we answer to. And our organisation, Football Victoria, is constituted by 350 clubs. So therefore, we are answerable to them. They're our bosses, and we have to appease them while simultaneously doing the best thing by the game, which sometimes can be a challenge, right? Because the interests of one club may not necessarily be the right thing for the game long term, because sometimes there might be mergers or getting clubs to share facilities or collaborating on certain facility outcomes. So you have to sort of adjust and be prepared to be flexible at times to make sure that those stakeholder needs are all met. I am probably a bit of a long-term person. I'm a real big picture person with my leadership, and also in terms of this role, I think you have to be. I think you have to get your eyes really focused on that North Star, whatever that is, whatever that sort of grand outcome is. And then if you push every decision that you make through that process, and in my case, is this good for the long-term future of the game? If you can push it through that process, and I used to always say, the real filter was, is this going to help Australia win a World Cup? That was always my first filter. And I used to possibly even think about it in a men's context. Now we have gender equity embedded in what we do. So I think, is this going to help us win men's and women's World Cups?
And that's much more likely in the women's context, as we know.
much more likely, as we've just seen. So
just missed out. Yeah,
around that as well. So when you factor all those things in, the challenge of the role and the leadership required, it's a wonderful challenge.
Yeah, fascinating. And then, I love what you just said there about long-term vision and long-termism, and Football Victoria having to do what's for the good of the game. Inevitably, in club football, short-termism is paramount for many clubs. You see it as being being implemented across clubs at all spectrums, whether from the lowest level to the top level. It's about winning more than anything else, and they take short-term decisions and short-term approaches. And inevitably, I guess in your role, you find there must be interests not aligning between particularly clubs, but maybe other stakeholders as well. How do you deal with that kind of conflict when, where you have maybe one of your biggest members or biggest clubs having it might not be a short-term approach, but having an approach to an issue which in the governing body's point of view is not in the best interests of the game? How do you manage that effectively to ensure that you can protect those interests and also maybe assist the club in achieving what they want to achieve as well?
I always remember I was working in Thailand actually, and advising a Thai Premier League club, and the coach, who I knew was a good friend of mine, he was sitting at dinner with the president of the club, and he was outlining his vision. Being newly appointed to the role, was outlining his big picture, how he wanted to evolve the club over the next 3 years, and he was sort of running through the items one by one. And the president just turned to him and said, "I have a better strategy. Let's just win." And that probably always thought was quite symbolic. You can have all the plans in the world, and in my hand, I'm holding here our state facility strategy to 2026. You can have all these wonderful strategies. You really can. But then equally, you do need to accept that there are other parts of the game that are performance oriented, and it's a high performance game, and winning is critical. So yeah, it can be a real challenge, particularly for a club that if they don't get their upgrade prioritized, they might risk being able to generate enough revenue to buy the players that can win them promotion, that might actually keep the club alive in some instances. So there might be, whereas I might come at it with a different perspective, which is no, we want this club to focus less on getting a surface upgrade, but more to get to upgrade their changing rooms, because we want to increase the number of women and girls rather than get your men's team promoted. That should be the focus for what we're going to do here, and take a bit more of a long-term approach. So there can be really competing demands of that. And I just think the key is, more than anything, is to communicate, open communication, honest communication. And you tend to find, I do think if you bring people along for the journey, and if you share your vision with them really, really clearly, and I think sometimes there is sort of an assumption in some cases that people should just know, but it's never like that. We should always share the visions that we have, bring others along for the journey, and take the feedback on board, because we might have to adjust, because we might even have it wrong. Yeah, we might have it wrong. We may need to adjust our expectations. So those are really critical things to remember.
Perfect. I love that Thailand story. I think I've heard it a couple of times before, but it actually...
You would have.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually reminded me, and I hadn't made that connection until you mentioned it again just now, but, Ange Postecoglou, who obviously cut his teeth in Victoria and coached in Victoria for many years before he went on his overseas journeys. In his very famous press conference recently, when pushed by a journalist, said, "I'm not judged by the balance sheet. I'm judged on sporting results." And this says that there's always that tension, isn't there, between long-termism and short-termism in sport, where the best laid plans are undone by winning or losing, so to speak. So I love that little Thai anecdote. Let's talk about your successes then, or your failures. But for me, I've been asking everyone, and I'd like to know for you in your position right now, what does success look like, and how do you measure that, if it can possibly be measured? Like, what's the ultimate, outcome at the end of the day for your, as you call them, regional CEOs and yourself in terms of success?
It's very blue sky thinking, if I may say so, because the treadmill will never end in the race for facilities. We will never get there in my lifetime. We will never achieve a football utopia in the way that we have in Europe, or even in some parts of Asia and South America. We will probably never have that utopia. But what we should aim to establish, and what I'm hopeful of putting the rubber on the road towards, is creating a football infrastructure here that basically means that no child misses out. And by that, I mean that you are within, reasonable distance of a good quality football field where you can have a really good quality experience. And if you're good enough, you can go on to the higher levels. But even if it's not necessarily in the performance element, you can join up with a club and be part of that club for the rest of your life. And that can be part of you, and you can contribute to your community through that. So I can sit here and sort of lay targets down about what success looks like in terms of getting X number of dollars out of the government or X number of facilities. And there are things like that. And we do want, we do want a massive number of new pitches, and we do want a lot of money. But I think the actual, in terms of really crystal clear success to me, would be much more about that getting each and every child to a club to have an experience that, James, quite frankly, when I was growing up and spending a lot of time on a farm, I had no access to a club. So I know what it's like not to have that. And I would want the next generation to have that, because I think that football can bring so many good things to so many people. And the more people it reaches, the better.
Love that passion. No, that's an excellent answer. I think that's really aspirational and something that you probably find replicated across many different smaller sports, but also big sports like football that struggle with some of Australia's cultural uniqueness when it comes to sport and its interaction with government and facilities. Well, Seb, look, got time for one more to finish up. Asking everyone, I think it's a bit of a softball question, to be honest with you, because everyone's pretty much given the same answer. Let's see if you go down the same track. But
oh boy,
future trends in football and sport, as a whole. Where do you see sport moving into the future? What are the key things we'll be talking about in a minute or so, or less if you can? What are the key headlines you think that are coming up in the next little decade or half decade?
Oh, so I'm sure everyone said esports and female sports. So I'll try to give something.
The second one's been the consistent answer. Yes, that's
right. And unsurprisingly, that's
of course.
I do think I will flag this. There are some concerns that I have about the split in the game between the professional tier, the top tier, the elite of the game, and the grassroots, in such a way that they've never been further apart than they are now. And I don't know if I'm worried, but I would flag that they are getting further and further apart. And we need to do more than ever to make sure that the parents, the volunteers, the people who are out there marking the lines, opening the canteen at 7 a.m. in the morning. James, I know you do it yourself for your local club. That is such an essential part of the game. And I think that we are potentially, as an entire sport, taking that a little bit for granted. And we need to work that bit harder as an entire sport to recognise that is football. Because sometimes I hear criticism, for example, in Australia, that the game's not doing well. That's not true, because actually the participation and grassroots level of the game is doing remarkably well. In fact, it's never been stronger. And we need to think about it in a more holistic way, that potentially, say, elements of the professional tier aren't doing well, but at the other level, at the grassroots and community, it's never looked stronger. And we also need to remember that. And I think that if we did that a little bit more, we'd feel a little bit more secure in our place as a sport. So that's probably an Australian side, but possibly elsewhere. I think, say, for example, in Europe, I'm a little bit concerned about some of the grassroots trends that we're seeing there, and just some of the attention span that we're seeing among the younger generation as well as volunteer burnout. Those are all things that I would flag as potential things that we should look at.
Great. Interesting ones. Participation rates and volunteer burnout, they're new ones. And so how to keep people involved in sport is the trend that you're referring to. So I think that's excellent. Well, Seb, look, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you on, notwithstanding our two Australian accents. And we'll look forward to seeing the reaction from the viewers to your episode. My pleasure. Thank you very much, Seb.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure being on with you, James.